Okay, perfect. Yes, so today we're going to talk about conifers and evergreens for Kentucky landscapes. And so just to kind of start off the chat, I think it's important to kind of mention, what is an evergreen, what is a conifer, because, sometimes people may mistake these terms. Um, so an evergreen is pretty much a plant that's going to retain its foliage throughout the year. Now, I will say sometimes they may shed their leaves over time as those age, but for the most part, this is a plant that's going to keep green foliage all year long. And this can be a shrub, this can be a tree. We have ground covers that are evergreen, so really the growth habit can vary widely. Now, we also have what are called conifers. So, conifers, not to give like a huge biology lesson here, but if you remember from biology, you probably learned about angiosperms versus gymnosperms. Angiosperms are your flowering plants, whereas conifers are your gymnosperms. And that concept means naked seed, meaning that these are plants where the seeds are actually found in cones. So the cones are carrying the seeds. They're not coming from the flowers that are fertilized and produce, that fertilized ovary. So kind of different form of reproduction there. Now we do get male cones and female cones on our different conifers, and the male cones will of course kind of spread that pollen to the female cones, and then of course it is fertilized and then it'll bear those seeds. Um, Most of the time with conifers, they're going to have kind of this needle shape or the scale-like shaped leaf. And many times these are generally evergreens, but this is not the case for all of them. So we're actually going to talk about a couple conifers today that are not evergreen. But then we're also going to be talking about some plants that are not conifers, but then they are evergreens. So some of our kind of more broadleaf evergreens, some of the shrubs that we're going to mention. So we're kind of going to do a mix of both. But really, the purpose of this class is we get a lot of people that ask questions like, what's an evergreen shrub? That's going to stay nice all year round, that I don't have to do much maintenance on. But then also, kind of to add to that coin, what are some great trees, specifically conifers, that will give that Christmas tree effect, if you will. So we're gonna talk about both of these. So let me start off by kind of mentioning why why I'm even having this class. And the reason for that is a lot of our conifer trees that we have or that we add to our landscapes generally struggle here in West Kentucky. And, there's actually several reasons for that. And we're going to kind of go in depth on this a little bit right here before I talk about particular species of plants. But that's the biggest thing. I would say, over probably 50 to 60% of my site visits that I go to regularly are usually some kind of struggling conifer, if I'm being honest with you. And so, what are the things that I'm noticing whenever I'm on these site visits? What do I see? So, just to kind of start off with, first one, conifers may not do well as single specimens, as in they may not do well if placed on their own in a landscape. And that might be a problem for some people because they may want to have kind of a plant that they showcase. Maybe they have a particular location in their landscape where that is kind of the showstopper piece. But realistically, a lot of our conifers actually will do better if they are grouped together, almost where they are able to have their roots intertwined. You would think that's almost counterproductive, that they may, compete for nutrients, but a lot of these serve a particular purpose with whether they're acting as a windbreaker or helping, in the case of severe storms, preventing them from falling over. So just to kind of give an example, the Virginia pine, which is one of our native pines here in Kentucky, it does better in groups versus as a single specimen. If you have just a single Virginia pine and then say we get a horrific storm, it could easily completely topple over just because it doesn't have quite that support. We also have needle cast diseases. This is like usually whenever I see a sickly conifer, it is because it has a needle cast disease. These are fungal diseases. Generally, what happens is we start to see some needle browning at the bottom of the tree, and then it makes its way up to the rest of the tree over time. You might get some needles that end up, becoming necrotic and browning and dropping. Um, and if it's not treated, potentially it could defoliate the tree and eventually lead to death. But it is one of those diseases, if you catch it early and you manage it, then you can still keep that conifer alive. But generally, needle cast diseases is always something I see. We had quite a bit of that this year. Even though we had a drought kind of the second half of the summer, our spring and early summer was pretty wet. And when we have a lot of moisture, of course, fungal diseases tend to go crazy. So that's something that we have to watch. Spruces are one of our major conifers that are very they do not tolerate needle cast disease at all. They are not very resistant to them. And so, because of that logic, we can't grow a lot of spruces really well here. And we'll kind of talk about the breakdown of which ones are better than others. Pest issues. Pest issues, mainly for conifers when it comes to insects. Bagworms is probably number one. They almost create those little brown, almost resembling pine cones. You can easily treat those. You can take those bags off if the caterpillar's in there and dispose of them. You could potentially spray something like BT, which is a natural insecticide. Really, the bad thing about BT is it's going to kill caterpillar species, so it could harm beneficial caterpillars as well, so you have to watch that. But if it's a conifer that is not too big that you could easily hand pick them off and dispose of them, then that's your best route. Otherwise, if you leave bagworms alone, if their population becomes too much, then they could also entirely defoliate, brown up a conifer. We also get things like bark beetles, different species of beetles, and they are borer insects. So they could be basically tunneling into the tree and eating the tree from the inside out, which is never good. We have a lot of issues with different kinds of borer insects, but that is certainly one that we have to monitor potentially as a pest issue too. And then other things we might get are some of your things like spider mites. Spider mites love conifers, but again, those are something that you could easily manage, especially if it's a low population. Other things to consider, and this really just goes for any plant that you're going to be growing, but especially conifers, if they are not in the right location, they are going to struggle. So you need to make sure they're in the right soil. A lot of conifers don't do well in heavy clay soils, so you want to give them in maybe a more nutrient rich, kind of full of organic matter, maybe a silty loam soil if available. pH is also a factor. Depending on the conifer, they may prefer more acidic or alkaline conditions. So you want to be testing your soil for the pH levels. You also want to check moisture. You want to see if your soil is well draining or not. Some species can prefer moist soils that are even swampy. Others can't tolerate any moisture and could develop root rot diseases. So we have to watch that. And then finally, lighting. is how much light are they getting? Is this a full sun conifer or is this one that's kind of more of an understory plant that prefers to be in more of a shaded environment? So those are all things to consider and important to know whenever before you're going to be planting these in your landscape. I also have to mention this incorrect planting so many times too when I go on site visits, the trees are struggling because of incorrect planting. A lot of times they're planted too deeply. I mean, you could plant them too shallow, but a lot of times the trees are planted too deeply. You don't see that proper root flare. And so that can have long-term impacts, especially if you pile loads of soil against the trunk of the tree and loads of mulch, and you create those mulch volcanoes. We don't want a volcano. We're going to want more of a donut shape, if you will. And really, you don't need more than about 2 to 3 inches of mulch around the tree, and you need to make sure that mulch is a few inches away from the trunk and not touching the trunk to avoid issues. So that's the other thing is just proper education when it comes to planting these trees. Fine, well, second to last thing, maintenance. So a lot of times we may not be doing proper maintenance on these trees. For example, not watering them well after we plant them. Maybe we're not providing them a good, thorough, deep water. We may not be watering them well in times of drought. I really emphasize that because this year as well, I saw quite a few arborvitaes that generally would do fine, but we had that severe drought where we went 30 plus days without water and they were not watered properly. And these were new plantings. So, of course, they were going to struggle and possibly die back. And so you just need to make sure that if we get significant weather, extreme weather like extreme drought, we need to be watering these plants, especially those first few years, is crucial. Overwatering is another thing. Usually it's not us. That's sometimes Mother Nature, and we can't always avoid that. But things we can avoid are things like over fertilizing. You may do an initial fertilization of your tree. You may run a soil test to see, but for the most part, when trees are established after a couple years, very rarely they need to be fertilized. Honestly, they're going to do fine on their own. Their roots will find the nutrients in the soil. And so we want to watch over fertilizing them because sometimes that can bring a lot of issues too. And then, of course, topping. Yeah, a lot of the utility companies are bad for that, and it that's just going to be a constant problem if these are planted near power lines. Finally, climate. Some of the conifers may prefer cooler summers or they may prefer a more hot, humid summer. And we're going to kind of showcase examples of both of these. And then others may prefer more mild winters versus colder winters. And so that's important when you're picking the conifer that's going to do best in not only your plant hardiness zone, but the general climate that you're in. We're here in West Kentucky. We're going to have more hot, humid summers. Traditionally, our winters are not terrible, but something we have to be mindful of is we do have the potential for extreme weather events, such as your polar vortex, if you will, where we may get a few days of ridiculously cold temperatures. And sometimes that can have a lasting impact on our plants. So I want to provide you with this resource, this website. This is our Department of Forestry at UK. They actually did a video series of some of our native conifers that we have here in Kentucky. So if you wanted to kind of see them a little bit more in depth, you could access those videos through this website. Um, we're going to cover some of these, not quite all of them. So let me kind of briefly mention some of the ones that maybe we're not going to cover as much in depth. One being Virginia pine. Again, as I had mentioned, that's one that does better when planted together. This is a very good pine for sites of like land or mine reclamation. Traditionally is where we kind of see Virginia pine planted, for those purposes. Eastern hemlock. So this is one, of course, like naturally, this is occurring more in the eastern side of the state along the Appalachian Mountains. Um, Really, really beautiful. One of my favorite conifers, honestly. Um, in its native habitat in eastern Kentucky, it's become susceptible to this pest, non-native insect called the woolly adelgid, and that's really taken a toll on the different populations of eastern hemlock. Um, for the hemlock that we have planted here, this isn't one that its native environment is not here in Western Kentucky. Um, so we don't really see issues with woolly adelgid here in West Kentucky. So I will say thing as a benefit is there are different cultivated varieties of Eastern hemlock that do well here in West Kentucky and make really great specimen plants. So even though elsewhere, it may not be doing well along the Appalachian Mountain Range because of the woolly adelgid, where it's not quite a problem here. You can grow some really nice specimen plants. I had a really great hemlock cultivar at my home, and it really hurt me so so hard that I had to get rid of it because it was right on a gas line. And so that's where it's like, know where to properly plant things. Call 811, know before you dig. But that tree had been established for a long time, no telling how long it was there. So it was, but I had so many birds that would come to it. So anyway, so yeah, Eastern hemlock could be a good option here. Shortleaf pine, not something we really see. This is native. It's kind of one of our more southern pines in the southern United States, but it is native here in Kentucky. It's usually referred to as like a pioneer species. It can invade. I hate to call it invasive because again, it's its natural habitat, but it can kind of take over where nothing else is really growing. Um, so we see shortleaf pine there. Pitch pine. Um, don't This is more of an Appalachian pine too, and honestly I see these more in my home state of Pennsylvania more so than I do here, and not so much really grown out here in West Kentucky, but they could be around. um we're going to talk about loblolly pine here in a little bit, but that's actually not native, even though we think it's native to the southeastern United States, and we've widely planted it here in Kentucky, but it's actually not a true native of Kentucky. But we'll get into some of these other ones here. All right. So initially with this slide, I wanted to call this "Do Not Plant," and then I thought to myself that sounds a little harsh. So I just put trees and shrubs with potential problems. So let me explain, because you might look at these and be like, "What are you talking about? These are fine." Okay, let me explain this. Eastern white pine. This is a native pine tree found all through Appalachia. I love Eastern white pines. They're beautiful, beautiful trees. Um, why am I giving this a question mark? The reason being, all around our county, people did at one time, say 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, if you will. I don't think people really knew where to properly plant Eastern white pine. They did not plant them in the right conditions and the right growing. environment to the point where I see nothing but issues with eastern white pines where they eventually die, unfortunately. And so that's why I bring this up, is because this is a great native plant. We kind of see it more in the Appalachian Mountains, kind of higher elevations, but again, it is a native. It could grow well here if we give it the right conditions. Biggest thing, avoid planting it in wet sites. For some reason, every time I see eastern white pines, they're around here. They are planted in low-lying areas that are poorly drained. Um, that's a problem. That's a problem for this species. Um, they succumb to a wide variety of diseases. There's white pine decline and white pine root decline. Of course, as you can imagine, with the root decline, it is no doubt due to um, wet soils, which it does not tolerate. Um, so that's a problem. Also, when it comes to the disease white pine decline, this is going to be something where the tree is going to appear otherwise very healthy for several years. Um, but it's going to then decline, and it almost is going to appear like it's declining rapidly. And that's because maybe it was planted in either very high pH, so very high alkaline soils, or in very heavy clay compacted soils. So you need to watch that with this tree. It's not going to tolerate those conditions, so it's not going to grow very well. So that's why I kind of mentioned eastern white pine on this list. Other pines, Scott, Austrian pines never do well here. I get a lot of site visits where I see a lot of different diseases. They're just plagued by diseases. Colorado blue and Norway spruces are the same way. See a million needle cast diseases always on these that they're struggling. And sometimes people will catch these too late. Um, Leland cypress, I I really I I don't want to say I hate this tree. This is a tree that was planted for 20, 30 years because it was the popular tree, especially as a privacy border. I don't understand it. It does not do well here long term. It may grow well for you for 10, 15 years, and then it just will completely die on you. That seems to be the trend here. So you may get a couple years out of it. Um, with Leland cypress, it's prone to a lot of fungal diseases. So there's this canker disease called Ceridium canker, and so it's prone to that. If it's in a very poorly drained site, which they tend to be, again, in more of those lower poor draining areas, it's going to succumb to a lot of root rot diseases. So you have to watch that. Most firs, same thing, except firs really just don't tolerate our climates as well. They may prefer kind of more of our more northern regions of the US. Getting into shrubs, and I should have mentioned this, I'm going to talk about trees first and then I'll get into the shrubs. Um, but um, Sorry, excuse me 1 minute. Um, so when it comes to shrubs, um, the ones that I'm not going to recommend are these may be obvious. Nandina, the heavenly bamboo. Um, this is um, this is a problem because especially some of the older varieties of Nandina, um, they will produce berries, which a lot of people planted them initially because they really liked the berries. They thought they were beautiful and aesthetic, but they are quite toxic, and if enough of these berries are eaten by birds, that could actually harm the birds, possibly kill them. There was actually a study done on cedar waxwings that had those issues where they ate too many, and it was like they consumed too much cyanide, to be honest with you. Um, so there are sterile varieties of Nandina, which is a step in the right direction where they don't produce the berries, but also in general, they're not great because they are considered invasive. They can spread easily. Um, it can be problematic there. I bring up boxwoods and cherry laurel. You can absolutely grow these, and for the most part, these are going to do well in your landscape. So I don't want to knock them for that. The reason why I'm bringing them up is because let's try to think outside the box. Let's not always plant boxwoods everywhere. But also, we've got several different blights that are plaguing boxwoods now. So we have to watch that. But also with some of the recent winters that we've had for both the laurel and boxwoods, um, we saw a lot of winter injury with both of them, especially when we had those winters where we had those really extremely cold temperatures for a few days. It really caused a lot of winter injury. And so we may want to consider picking shrubs that could tolerate some of those cooler temperatures, those extreme cooler temperatures a little bit better than these can. Again, I'm not knocking them because they're great, and they're going to do well, but let's kind of look outside the box, not always pick these, and again, be mindful that they could be prone to winter injury when we get some severe cold. All right. Let's go into trees. So let's talk about the trees first. So we have American arborvitae, and we do have native arborvitae here. There are some non-native species. There are a lot of cultivated varieties of arborvitae. These are going to vary from trees to shrubs, and we'll talk about the shrubs too after a while. But these are great. If you are looking for either a privacy screen, almost like a hedge, just somewhere to kind of hide things, arborvitae is a good option. And generally, these are going to do well here in Kentucky. When I see these not doing well, it's one, because maybe they didn't receive enough water, because they do like the soil to be moist, not soggy, but moist. Um, and also because they just were not planted correctly to begin with. So they were planted in a hurry by some kind of landscape company. So that's the main issues I see. If you can try to plant these in a way where they're not going to get so much of the wind impact, because they do not like too windy of a site and may struggle a little bit there. But this is a conifer that has more scale-like leaves. They will become more bronzy during the winter months. You could potentially get a little bit of winter injury there, but for the most part, it's going to stay evergreen. This is going to do better in fuller sun. It's going to have thicker foliage. Full shade is going to cause the foliage to thin out quite a bit. So you need to be mindful of that. This will produce a cone. It's just a small oblong brown cone. You also may want to consider putting a fence up or keeping these caged, especially younger ones, because of significant damage from deer browsing. We do have a lot of deer in this county, and so they could have some significant injury from deer. But overall, good screening, privacy, conifer, great nesting site for birds. And again, we do have native species here of arborvitae. Another native that we have is American holly. So American holly is very much, we have so many cultivated varieties of this plant. Anything from a full tree that's 40 to 60 feet tall to then we can have some smaller, more compact shrub varieties. So so there's a lot out there. Generally, this is a really nice pyramidal shape. The limbs are going to stay near the ground. So sometimes with conifers, if they don't lose those lower limbs, we may have to prune those off just for the cases of mowing or things of that nature. So these will generally keep their limbs near the ground. The leaves they produce could be both spiny, like we think of traditional hollies, or they could be entire meaning kind of like smooth edge, if you will. Um, they they are what we refer to as dioecious plants, and there's quite a few that we're going to talk about tonight that are dioecious. So these have both male and female plants. In order for you to get the red berries, you need to have a male fertilize a female plant. Um, but both will produce these small, kind of insignificant white flowers. But those are very attractive to bees, so don't want to knock them for their flowers. So it's a really good pollinator plant for that purpose. And then the berries are enjoyed by our wildlife. Um, so this is a good all around tree specimen. I really like hollies. I don't find them to be prone to too much issues. Um, Sometimes where there's issues is if they're in a very alkaline pH, so they don't tolerate a lot of like limestone, if you will. And so they're going to prefer more of a neutral to acidic soil. So we just want to be mindful of the pH. Um, if you're not sure if it's a male or a female tree when you're purchasing it, like, it may not be flowering for you or bearing fruit. Generally, the cultivars are like if it sounds like a female's name, like there's a cultivar called Judy Evans, then that's probably a female plant. But then if there's like a male name, like it sounds like a male's name, the cultivar is probably a male. So if that kind of helps you out a little bit, if it doesn't say if it's male or female, if you do have the cultivar name, that can kind of help you to distinguish between them. Bald cypress. I love these trees. So this is one of our conifers that is not an evergreen, okay? So not all conifers are evergreens, okay? So this is what we refer to as a deciduous conifer. It's going to lose its needles, and a lot of people may not know this, and so they come and they think something's wrong with their tree. Their tree all of a sudden went orange and brown and then dropped its needles, and so it must be dead. But they didn't realize that this is a bald cypress, and that's actually a very natural process for it. Um, this is a really beautiful tree. Now, I get maybe if you were trying to use this for privacy, it may not provide as much privacy during the winter months, but all in all, if you've got a moist site at on your property, plant bald cypress, absolutely. They're going to do very well, and they can tolerate a wide range of different conditions. These will get tall um, in time as well. Um, these are often like if you see kind of like cypress, especially kind of in more of our swamped areas, they produce these what are called cypress knees, which are kind of grown near the water. The male cones it produces male and female cones. The male cones are usually kind of yellow to brown and are in clusters. The female cones are kind of more globular and a green to brown color. In that top picture, you kind of can see that it almost looks alien. A lot of people are like, what in the world is this? Like, what do you even call this? And that is their actual cone. Um, So very neat in that regard. Um, this plant is great for supporting wildlife. The seeds that are produced from these cones are eaten by turkeys. A lot of our waterfowl, like our wood ducks, will eat them. Um, so it's great for that. These could even provide great breeding sites for some of our amphibian species, especially if they're near water. The older trees are actually going to hollow out. But when we think, a lot of times when we think of hollow trees, we kind of get concerned for that. But if this is not near a structure, just kind of leave them be because a lot of times those hollow areas are used for wildlife for shelter. Eastern red cedar. This is another native. A lot of people hate these because they kind of think of them as a weedy tree species, even though they're found here. Um, Look, it just goes to show you that this is just a tree that can tolerate a wide variety of conditions. So it should be able to grow well in your landscape if you see it along the parkway, you know, really, I see them a lot on the parkway, and sometimes people will even put ornaments on them for Christmas. Um, but, you know, there are, even if you don't like the kind of native, kind of the original species, there are a lot of cultivars out there of the Eastern red cedar that look a little bit more pleasing, if you will, a little more ornamental. Maybe they have a deeper green color versus kind of the more yellowish green um, that the species had. They might have a little bit better of a structure to them. So again, kind of be on the lookout because there are some varieties that are a little bit more improved, if you will, if you want more of that ornamental aesthetic. Um, but these are great. They produce these little blue cones that we call juniper berries. It's not an actual berry, and yes, it is a cone, and yes, it is enjoyed by wildlife. Um, Eastern red cedar, we think of the cedar waxwing, right? So they do enjoy these little berries that are on there. And overall, this is a plant that's very resistant to damage from deer, very resistant to drought. It's very dependable. It's going to grow better in full sun. It may be more slow growing in kind of more shaded conditions. Um, some of the issues that I see with this is it could be prone to apple rust, cedar apple rust disease, which is kind of that fungal disease that produces those very wonky orangey things on there. Um, may also be prone to bagworms, but again, you can knock those bagworms off. Some good cultivars out there would be ones that are called Taylor and Greenpoint. Loblolly pine. So this is what I mentioned. This is not a true Kentucky native. Surprisingly, it is native to the southeastern United States, and it has been planted pretty widely here in Kentucky. This is a great option because this is a pine that actually likes our hot, humid summers. Where other pines may struggle a little bit, this is going to do better with our hotter summers. Now, with that said, they do prefer more of a mild winter. So potentially, if we have a really harsh cold winter, it might be susceptible to some damage. So you kind of want to watch that. This is a tree that's going to actually lose its lower branches as it ages, so you may not have issues with having to prune it, because of mowing, so to speak. It's going to be a great option if you have areas that are more poorly drained or moist, but it can tolerate, you know, different types of soil conditions. And this is one of our faster growing pines. It's generally going to stay in a landscape about 40 to 50 feet tall, but it could go upwards of 90 feet in the right conditions. This pine, and I should have mentioned this with the eastern white pine. The eastern white pine has bundles of 5 needles, whereas this has bundles of 3. needles, sometimes two, but mostly three. Um, it produces these big brown cones that, if you're not careful, could kind of stab you. And some of our pine cones have what we call recurved spines on them, so they could poke you. So just kind of be mindful of that. But otherwise, they're kind of a really cool pine cone um, to have and to showcase. Um, this is great for wildlife. It's a host plant for the imperial moth, caterpillar. Some things I'll mention with loblolly. I wouldn't plant these too close to your home. And I mean, really, a lot of these conifers, I wouldn't recommend planting too close to your home anyway for as tall as they can be. Um, but this does have a high flammability. And that's something to be mindful of with some of our conifers. Some of them may have high flammability. So if we have kind of like where we had a prolonged drought and then we get some winds, you don't want to risk a fire accidentally erupting and then it consumes your home, because the tree was planted so close to your home or another structure. So that is something else to think about. That might not be our first thought whenever we're planting these trees, but just kind of note that is flammability is something to keep in mind. For the most part, we have more warmer, wetter climates here in West Kentucky, but we could still get droughts where we could have fire risk, of course. Oriental spruce. Okay. As I had mentioned, most spruces are not going to do well here. Um, Oriental is one of the better ones. It's still not going to do great, if I'm being honest with you. But if you were really bound and wanting to have a spruce species of some kind, I would go with the Oriental spruce. Um, it could still struggle in some of our hot, more humid climate, but it's going to do better if you give it a little bit more moist, nutrient-rich soil and if you can protect it from wind, because it could be susceptible to some of our winter winds. But as most people love spruces is with their shape. It has a very nice pyramidal shape to them. And just has really nice dark green needles. So let me mention the Colorado blue spruce because a lot of people have that and they do well here. And honestly, what we found, it seems, is for some of those that are planted 20, 30 plus years ago, those older varieties tend to do okay and perform well and or make great specimens. But then try to plant some newer varieties or just some young trees, young spruce trees, and they just immediately succumb to disease. And so you may have some really great specimens, honestly, some different spruce species that have been around a long time. And that's because they just seem to be a little bit more resilient to the problems. Whereas if you try to plant, like I said, a young sapling, if you will, it could struggle. So, you know, just something to keep in mind there. But I mean, spruces are beautiful. I get it. Like my grandparents had a beautiful Colorado blue spruce that I always admired. It was just a gorgeous, gorgeous tree. Um, so I get the appeal of wanting to keep these in your landscape. And so again, if you do want the spruce, um, then maybe go for the Oriental one. Southern magnolia. So this may not come as a surprise. This is one of our more broadleaf evergreens. So it's not a conifer. This is an evergreen tree, but it will keep its foliage for the most part all year. Sometimes it will lose some of its leaves in the fall and spring months, just kind of shedding them. But for the most part, it keeps those beautiful green leaves, and they're very fuzzy, kind of leathery to the touch. This in its native environment is actually an understory tree, but if you let it grow, you have a huge space for it. It can easily get ridiculously tall and big and just kind of overtake the landscape, which a lot of people want that. They want that specimen tree, that magnolia. And we have quite a few of these around town too. It just has a great shape to it. Of course, a lot of people love the fragrant white flowers that produces, and then they'll give way to these red seeds, colorful seeds as well. If there's any drawbacks to this magnolia, it would just be that these can be a little bit messy of a tree, so you may not want to keep these too close to your home. Kind of keep them a little bit further out in the landscape because, again, they do periodically drop leaves. Seed pods may drop some limbs occasionally. So you may want to keep it away from a structure or too close to a house because you don't want it to risk it hitting your home. Um, let's see, what else? There are more dwarf cultivars out there. Little Gem, Bracken's Brown Beauty, if you don't want to get a super tall tree. Okay, firs. Firs are like the spruces. Very few firs are going to do well in Kentucky. I hate to tell you this, and everyone wants a fir because they want kind of the genuine Christmas tree look, and I get that. So if you feel like you have to have a fir, what is the one to pick? That would be the white fir is probably your best one. It's not going to do great, but it's probably the best one of all the bunches, if I'm being honest with you. Um, it hates heavy clay soils. So if that's all you have around your property, then you don't even want to attempt to grow this. If you have a little bit better organic, silty loam, anything that's not heavy clay, it's going to tend to do better. When we this is going to be one of those trees that, of course, might prefer more northern climates. It likes longer winters and cooler summers. So, obviously, if we have a very hot, humid summer, it could very well struggle in that regard. This is one of those where they may prefer higher elevations as well as a result. It's just not generally the right climate or the right habitat for it here. But if you can kind of give it those right conditions, it may perform okay for you. You just don't want to keep this tree too hot or too dry if you can. Now, one thing I'll mention is, some people might be planting firs um, for the purpose of Christmas tree operations. Um, and generally with Christmas tree operations, you just want the trees to get to a certain size and then they'll be cut down. But generally with a lot of Christmas tree operations, they take a lot of care, a lot of spraying for diseases and insects. And so, you need a lot of help in that regard. Um, Kind of one of your more common firs that's used as like a classic Christmas tree is the Caucasian fir. All right, let me go into shrubs now. Um, and I should have mentioned this originally. It's like every time I would always prefer that you plant native as much as possible, but I do know that we are limited with some of our more evergreen or conifer native species. We have a lot of deciduous species. And so, some of the things I am mentioning are non-native. I try not to ever recommend anything that would be considered invasive in nature. So, hopefully we can kind of keep to that. Real quick, we already mentioned arborvitae and holly, so I wanted to just showcase that there are great shrub options of these species. Excuse me. On the left, you'll see a good kind of globular arborvitae specimen. And then on the right, you'll see kind of a lower growing holly bush. So they make great specimens as shrubs in the landscape. This is one of our non-natives I'm going to talk about. Chinese juniper. And I mean, these are planted pretty widely, almost as much as boxwoods. But the reason I like them and recommend them is there's so many different varieties out there, so many different varieties that are a cultivated variety of the Chinese juniper, the original Chinese juniper. They can be anywhere from more trees to shrubs to even kind of mat forming ground covers. Their leaves are going to range from scale-like to needle-like. These are dioecious too, where you have female and male plants, and the females, if they are properly fertilized, are going to produce that fleshy berry-like seed cone. So these do produce a cone as well. There's different colors, ones that have more of a blue silvery coloration to the foliage, others that may be more chartreuse. So there's quite a bit of diversity there, quite a bit of breeding that has occurred. But for the most part, these are going to be great landscape plants. The only things you have to watch is you don't want to put it in too moist of soil, because these could be susceptible to root rot disease. Um, that's really the main thing is if you see these struggling, it's because it might be in soggy soil. But then it's a juniper. It could be susceptible to cedar apple rust disease, which again is kind of that fungus with the bright orangey, weird alien type projections, if you will, that we sometimes see. So, but not something that can't be treated either. Root rot diseases are another story, but cedar apple rust you can manage. This is one I wanted to mention is evergreen viburnums. So we have native viburnums here in Kentucky. Viburnums they're a diverse group too, where we have primarily we're thinking about the deciduous ones, but there are evergreen to semi-evergreen viburnums that are available that will relatively keep their foliage throughout the whole season. Oftentimes that foliage is pretty deep green and kind of glossy in appearance. And they will, as with the deciduous viburnum, still produce those beautiful clusters of white flowers. Some of them may be more fragrant than others. And those will then give way later in the season to colorful berries, to eventually a beautiful bright red berry. And those berries are eaten by wildlife. And the flowers too are enjoyed by pollinators. And so viburnums generally very non-fussy plants, very easy in a landscape. I would always recommend a viburnum, any kind. And so if you need an evergreen species, again, you want something that still has that color even throughout the winter months, you could pick an evergreen viburnum. My mom has had one in her garden. I would say probably they've been probably at their property for over 30 years and it still looks great and is still growing wonderfully. So it's a pretty hardy plant. So I would definitely recommend planting viburnums as an option. False cypress. So false cypress, there are different species of this plant. Some of the species are found actually both on the western and eastern coasts of North America. Others are native to East Asia. So it just kind of depends on the species that you're picking up. But I will say, if you want kind of more of an evergreen that gives a little bit of interesting color or texture, false cypress is a good option for you. These could get tall, so these actually could make great hedges or border trees. You could get false cypress trees, but then you could also pick up more of your dwarf compact shrub varieties, kind of based on the picture that you see here. These are going to do well. I always see these doing well. I never really see them doing poorly, if I'm being honest. They like more moist, well-draining soil, full sun to partial shade, relatively non-fussy. You plant this and it's going to grow for you, honestly. The leaves are more scale-like, but the coloration of those leaves are going to vary again from green to even more of the chartreuse coloration. Um, they just make great specimens. If I had to say any drawbacks to them, it would be if you give them too much water, like if it's poor draining and it just stays soggy all the time, it could be prone to some root rot diseases. So you may just want to watch if it's in too wet of a condition. Sometimes it could be prone to like juniper blight, but not something that I see very often. I really don't see a lot of pests or disease issues on false cypress. So if you're just one of those people, you want low maintenance, you want something to look good all year round, this is your option here. Another good option is Japanese plum yew, and this is a Japanese yew. I will say English yews also do well. These are an evergreen shrub. They have interesting growth habits, especially this Japanese one, where it has these interesting kind of V-shaped leaf pattern on them, almost feather-like needles. This, like some of the other species we talked about, like the hollies, they are dioecious. So you have male and female plants. The female plants will produce the red, fleshy coated bear. I said berries, fleshy coated seeds. Um, a very easy plant to just kind of keep trimmed back and prune, kind of shape it. I have an English yew in the front yard that does really well. But like I said, I mean, yews generally do well here in our climate. Sometimes they say English yews may not be quite as hardy, but um, generally they seem to do fine here. Um, One thing I'll just kind of mention with yews is that all parts of the plant are pretty much very toxic. If you consume them, they're fine to handle, they're fine to touch. It's more if they are consumed, you just have to watch children or pets. I think, like, if I remember this correctly, I think the one part of the yew that is not toxic is the actual fleshy part around the seed, although the seed itself is very toxic, but maybe the flesh is not. So I don't know. Um, Kind of an interesting thing there. But it's again, you're looking for, I just want an evergreen shrub. I just want to have to trim it every so often if it gets a little too unruly. This is your plant. Okay, so for all those people out there that they're like, I just want very low maintenance, that and the false cypress are kind of your easygoing shrubs there that are not boxwoods. I want to mention mountain laurel because it's kind of going to lead us into our last plant that we'll talk about, and that is the rhododendrons. Um, this is in the Ericaceae family. Mountain laurel is found across the eastern United States, especially in the Appalachian mountain range. This is very much the state flower of Pennsylvania, and see these everywhere in Pennsylvania, and I absolutely love them, especially when they bloom in spring, and they're just beautiful. They produce these gorgeous clusters of these white to pinkish bell-shaped flowers. Um, it has evergreen foliage. It's a little bit glossy and leathery in appearance. Um, Even though this is one that really generally you're seeing more in Appalachia, okay? Um, in this case, Eastern Kentucky. If you give it the right conditions, you could grow it here. It's not necessarily something that it's like, this is the great ornamental shrub. I probably wouldn't recommend this normally, but if you wanted plants that were shrubs that were native to kind of the eastern half of the United States that do have good that are beneficial to wildlife or insect biodiversity, things of that nature, then you may want to consider this. I say beneficial to wildlife. One thing I'll mention is if you have farm animals, keep it away from farm animals because it is quite toxic to livestock. Um, Gives it a little bit more deer resistance, I guess you could say. Um, but especially for your insect pollinators, it's a good option. But the thing about this is, even though it could grow in like full to partial shade to shadier conditions, it's the soil um, that you have to be mindful of. This is not going to grow well in very heavy clay soils, very wet soils. It is going to struggle and it's going to die. And so, unfortunately, we have a lot of this here, especially in developments where topsoil's been completely removed. So if you did want to grow this just because you really admire this and you just like that family of plants in general, you'll want to consider um, you putting these in raised beds, okay, or putting them kind of in more of a mound shape just to improve that drainage because otherwise it's going to be very susceptible to root rot issues. So just be mindful of that. Again, this is not like one that I would recommend. This is your ornamental shrub you should all get, but if it's something where you admire some of these more native species and you want to incorporate them, then you may want to try the mountain laurel and just see how it does here. All right, so that'll lead to our last one for tonight. And so that is the rhododendron genus. And so the rhododendron genus supports a wide variety of different species, including our rhododendrons and our azaleas, which we do have native rhododendrons, again, more found on the Appalachian side of the state, but they are there. A lot of the cultivars that we have are not that, or maybe it's a cultivated variety of that original species. But um, generally, rhododendrons and azaleas do pretty well here. A lot of people love them because they are very colorful, especially in the spring months, producing a lot of white, pink, red, rose, purpley colored blooms to them. Um, and pollinators, especially with rhododendrons, would like these. I see a lot of bees come to them. So like this bottom picture is one of my rhododendron at my house. There's my puppy when she was really young. This is like she was like not even a year old and now she's like 6 years old. So she's a bit older now. But I love rhododendrons because they are so vibrant. They bring some of that nice color in the spring. And then I've got sensitive fern underneath it, and I just love that picture and that combination. Um, Biggest thing with these, um, and I should mention, of course, these are evergreens. It's an evergreen broadleaf plant. Um, where they're not going to do well is a number of things. First off, most of you probably know with rhododendrons, azaleas, they like more acidic soils. So a lot of times we may add a little bit more acid. Um, at planting or like around these just to kind of lower that pH a little bit. So that's number one. They have a preference for more acidic soils. Number two, they like it moist, but they don't like it like soggy. Like it doesn't need to be soggy, but a consistent moisture that it's still able to drain well is going to be the right conditions for this plant. Okay. If they're in too moist of an environment where it's soggy, it's drowning in it, if the soil is too heavy clay, um, if it's really compacted, things like that, it's going to be more susceptible to things like root rot diseases and just overall dieback. And so you kind of want to be mindful of those conditions. Um, you also want to be mindful with pruning these too. Sometimes I find that people will over prune these in landscapes. The best time to prune these is going to be after flowering. Okay. So immediately after flowering, you can trim them how you need to, or remove any dead or diseased limbs off of them. Um, just because if you wait till late, till the season, and especially for rhododendrons that they've already started to produce their flower buds for next year, you don't want to accidentally cut off the flower buds and then you don't have any blooming. So that would not be good. Um, but in general, these are a great flowering evergreen shrub. We don't have a lot of that. We don't have a lot of evergreen shrubs that will flower. We're thinking, again, more of our conifers that we talked about. And so these are one of the ones that are a little bit more widely around and available and generally do okay under the right conditions. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing and um, I'll go ahead and take any questions that anyone has. So feel free to unmute yourself if you've got a question. Mhm. No questions? All right. With that, let
I,
me
I thought of
go ahead,
one.
Beverly. Yeah, go ahead,
Uh,
Beverly.
I really need to replace some of my azaleas that are not doing very well or haven't ever done very well. They seem to have some kind of disease where the leaf gets thick. I don't know what it is, but anyway, there's a few spots. What about, and I'm considering the that other one I mentioned. I got a blank right now, but the rhododendron. How how can I've got to keep them below my windows.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what? How far? By the way, my husband's been listening to this the whole time. He's beside me. How how what's the minimum how much trimming can you do on them? But my windows
Rhododendron.
probably on some of them the windows are this high. I mean, up to my shoulders.
Yeah, azaleas are definitely a better fit for that versus rhododendrons. Rhododendrons can get quite big, and
Yeah, I've noticed yours was tall.
yeah, they get quite big, and they don't always appreciate too much of a heavy prune either. So
Yeah, I know my sister had one. She had to trim it, and I haven't really asked her how it's fared.
yeah,
Okay.
I generally
Oh,
kind of shape them occasionally, like if there's like a weird piece that's out of whack or like kind of taking like maybe blocking like the stairs or something like that of my porch, but otherwise I just kind of leave it be. Like I really won't prune it at all. So,
well, I'll have to do some more research for that other one you mentioned, the viburnums.
yeah.
You have any viburnum variety that you know is a good one for a shrub?
I have a lot of like deciduous viburnums that I love. Like Eskimo and Mohawk are really great because those are very fragrant blooms. But again, that's a deciduous one. I don't know if that matters, um,
Well,
but
I have a Belia grandiflora around my front, and I don't care if it loses leaves during the winter. You
mhm.
know, to me, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, definitely
Doesn't have,
Eskimo and Mohawk. Mohawk's my personal favorite because it has it starts out by having these pink flower buds and then they'll open white and then they're extremely fragrant. So it's a beautiful, beautiful plant.
well, I was looking at the viburnums earlier this afternoon, and I thought, golly, there's hundreds of them
Hmm.
of
Yeah.
viburnums.
And you can't go
So,
wrong with them, honestly. Like that's just
okay,
they're a
okay,
tried and true, very non-fussy plants. So
okay. Well, I've enjoyed this.
good, good, good. So what I'll do, I'm gonna